Well, we're starting a new series today, and I don't know how many of you have heard of, they got this new thing, 23andMe. It's been around for a few years. It's DNA testing. They send you a test tube, and you spit into it. You have to collect so much saliva, then you send it back to them, and they can tell you a lot about your ancestry, about some of your traits, and medical predispositions. Some of you may have done this. Some of you may have heard about it. Ancestry.com does this as well. And preparation for this new series, several weeks ago, Molly and I decided to submit our samples to 23andMe. Molly's brother had done it and was showing us his results, so I thought this would be a cool thing to do. And since we were coming up with a series coming up related to that, we did that. And so last week we got Molly's results back, and mine were not. They did not come. And then they sent me said that they had a bad sample. So that was that shows you what is that thing. But so I don't have my results yet. But Molly's came back and. This is what it came back from Molly. You can tell where your ancestors come from your spit. I guess you spit and they test it somewhere in California. And Molly came back as 100% European, her background. Mine will not be 100% European, I'll just tell you that right now. But she's 65, 2/3 basically from the United Kingdom, British and Irish. French and German, 20% Scandinavian. I guess that's like the old Vikings of old, and some of the other broadly Northwestern, Southern European. But beyond this, there was also some interesting things we learned about her as far as her traits. For instance, they were able to tell from Molly's spit, from the spit, okay, I think my spit was too bubbly. I think that's what it was. It was so bubbly, it was like it wouldn't go down into the tube. But they discovered that they said she's likely to have blue or green eyes, which is true. So it's very likely she has light hair, which is true. Also said that she would not have a unibrow, no unibrow, which, if you know Molly, she doesn't have a unibrow. But very interesting that said that she would have something called the photic sneeze reflex. Okay, anybody ever heard of the photic sneeze? Anybody have that? It's where she had inherited it from her dad, that when the sunlight hits you, you sneeze. Does anybody have that? Some of you have that, yeah. Apparently, you can never be a fighter pilot in the Air Force if you have that, apparently. I don't know, maybe Rick can tell me that. He's nodding his head, yeah. And so I think both of my sons have inherited that, and so it rules them out. But very interesting what you can learn from something like that. Waiting to find out what to get mine back. But I've done some research on my family background and my ancestry. When I was a kid, my grandmother gave me one of these ancestry charts. I don't know if you've ever seen this. It's like March Madness in reverse. You know, where you start off here and you figure out who your parents are and who their parents are. And so growing up, I learned a lot about my family background. Learned a lot about my ancestry from my grandmother on my dad's side. In fact, she would take me around to graveyards. We all grew up in the same. My mom and my dad some people's parents are from different parts of the country. My parents are from different parts of the county, okay? And like back 3 or 4 different generations, okay, for real. And so I learned a lot about my family, and I learned about my great-grandfather, who was a World War I hero. He fought with the 167th Regiment, the Alabama Regiment, who fought in some of the pivotal battles of World War I. In fact, they helped to turn the tide of the war, and had significant losses. In fact, my great-grandfather would sit around and tell the kids about war stories, and their eyes would bug out. Anytime they were misbehaving, I guess, or something like that. But he would volunteer for all of the missions that they said, this is an expeditionary, sending out this group, and it's very likely you will not come back alive. He would volunteer for those expeditions. Then I heard about my great-grandfather on my mom's side, who was a great man of God, a man who loved the Bible, who loved God's Word. In fact, Paul Duffy, who was really a legend in this part of the country, he passed away a few years ago, but he was a pastor of First United Methodist Church in Montgomery for many years and became a bishop in the United Methodist Church. His first appointment was Abbeville and Liberty, which is where my parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents were. And he said that, this is a quote from a family member of what Paul Duffy said. He said, I learned half the Bible from Oscar Cotton, my great-grandfather. That probably wasn't true, but I heard him reference some folks, great lay people, in a sermon he preached when I was ordained about 11 years ago, where he talked about his first appointment, and I knew he was talking about probably my great-grandfather. I learned about my 4 times great-grandmother, who was an Indian princess, who married a British captain, Captain William McIntosh, and they had a daughter who was my 3 times great-grandmother, but they also had a son who was named William McIntosh, who was an Indian chief, a pretty famous Indian chief. You may have heard about him. I found out I was related to Gloria McDonald in the early service. She said, "That's my relative." So we were we were related. Found that out in the early service. On my father's side, my 4th great-grandfather, whose name was Matthew, he was one of the first of that family to come into Alabama. They had a plantation in what is today Henry County there on the river. He served in the Alabama legislature. So I learned a lot about my family growing up. But then as I got older, I joined something called Ancestry.com to learn some more, and learned a lot more. In fact, I learned some things that weren't the stories that were passed down to me. I learned about my great-grandfather, the war hero, and I learned about his great-grandfather of the same last name who died in prison in Georgia. And he was in prison twice. First time for raping his niece, and the second time for attempting to kill his wife, which led to an altercation with his son, which was my 5th time great-grandfather. And ultimately, this man took his own life in prison. I learned that Chief William McIntosh, who was the great Indian chief, and related to his sister, who was my 3 times great-grandmother, that, in fact, he was a great Indian chief who gave away all the land of his tribe. In fact, he gave away all the Creek Indian land in Georgia. He got rich by giving it away underhandedly. Basically, he stabbed his own people in the back, and what happened was that he was assassinated by some of the Creek warrior braves who came to his house in the middle of the night and killed him. I learned that on my father's side, some of those plantations owners that I know for a fact, looking at census records 150 years ago, the first Mobleys of my tribe, my Mobleys to move into Alabama, that they owned slaves. And I discovered that there are places in the tree where it doesn't fork. Yes, there are places where it does not fork. Going back there, cousins marrying, and that's what's wrong with me. But anyway, you look at that, and you ever look at one of these charts, and all these people, you have one just like I do, and you may not even know what the story is there, but every one of those lines is a life. And every one of those is a story. And whether you recognize it or not, their story has a big influence in your story. You are who you are because of their story, for good or for bad. Our new series today we're starting today is Thick Blood. And it comes from the saying, blood is thicker than water, which means that family relationships sometimes are the most closest relation. Actually, I think it's kind of a takeoff of that particular saying. But our theme for this series, which is going to be throughout the month of June and take us up to the 1st of July, is that there are no relationships that have more influence on us than our family relationships. And we're going to look at some stories from the Bible about family dynamics and the way that families interact with each other that I think sheds light on our own families, the way that we interact with each other, and hopefully will help us to have insight in how we can have positive influence on our family members moving forward. But the first thing that we have to acknowledge is that every one of us, we have a story, we have a backstory. Every family has a backstory. And what our parents did and what our grandparents did has an influence on us today. And that's true for us as individuals, and it's true for us, in a sense, as a country, and it's true for us as a Christian faith and Christianity. Christianity has a backstory. In fact, the whole Old Testament is the backstory of the Christian faith. For those of Jesus' day, for the Jews of Jesus' day, they could not understand their faith apart from their family story. That's the only way. The only way they knew who God was because what God had done with those who went before them, specifically with their own ancestors. And if it wasn't their ancestors, it was people who were related to their ancestors. For example, when God introduces himself to Moses In Exodus chapter 3, there's the burning bush, and Moses walks up to it, and he's like, what's going on? And it says the angel of the Lord is in the bush, and he speaks to Moses out of it. He calls Moses by name. Moses is like, who are you? And God said in Exodus chapter 3, verse 6, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Those are your ancestors. I am their God. You're going to know who I am because I am the God of your fathers. And then Moses, he tells Moses, he says, I'm calling you to go lead my people out of slavery in Egypt. And Moses is like, who am I to do that? And he said, first of all, what am I even going to tell them is this God's name? Who is this God? And God says to them, you are to tell them this. You shall say to the Israelites, Exodus 3:15, the Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. Basically, you're going to tell them that God that you heard about way back that made those promises to our ancestors hundreds of years ago, I'm that God. You're going to know me on the basis of what I did and I said and I promised and did for them because those same promises apply to you. Well, one thing about our background as Christians and the biblical story, and it really finds its roots in this, is that we understand history in a different way because of our Judeo-Christian background. This is part of it's just part of the way that we understand time and history is that we look at time as being linear, that everything is moving in a certain direction, that history is building towards something, that there's a certain purpose for history. And we understand that because our ancestry chart is like March Madness in reverse. We are the champions of our ancestry chart. It was all building to us to get us here. And of course, there will be the continuation. The story continues past us. But while we understand history in a linear fashion, which is a little different than Eastern philosophies, which see history as cyclical, they believe in reincarnation and all that kind of stuff, that everything repeats itself. We don't see history necessarily that way, but we do believe that our backstories can repeat themselves. Backstories can repeat themselves. In other words, what your parents did and what their parents did and what their parents did has influence. History can repeat itself, and in fact, it often does. One example in the Bible, and there's plenty of examples, we're just going to look at one of those today, is the example of the first story, the first name that was listed when God spoke and he said, I'm the God of your ancestors. That's where the salvation story begins. It begins with a guy that we know his name is Abraham. He originally was named Abram. God changed his name to Abraham. Abraham's parents were polytheists, which meant that they believed in many gods, not just one God. They believed and worshiped many gods. In fact, Abram was a polytheist. And he may have always been a polytheist. The God of the Bible, the true God, spoke to him and called him. And the people of Israel came to understand their identity based upon what happened to Abraham. What do we know about Abraham? Well, he was a wanderer. He left home. He left his homeland to go to a land that God promised him, to Canaan. Abraham prospered. And as a result of his prosperity, he had disputes with some of the surrounding people in Canaan. Who is this newcomer? And look how he's so prosperous. And he had disputes with him. He especially had disputes over wells, which were a very precious commodity in those days. A lot of effort to dig a well, and there wasn't a lot of water around that. So he had to negotiate all of that. You know the story of Abraham? You know that he and his wife Sarah battled with infertility, and that's an understatement. They were very, very old when they had their child. Sarah had her first child. But we know God's promise to him. God made a promise to Abraham that he would bless him and prosper him, and that he would make a great nation from him. That's Abraham's story. What's interesting is that we see Abraham's story repeated in his son, Isaac. Isaac, who was also a wanderer. He also lived in a tent his whole life like Abraham. Abraham never built a house, settled in one place. He was always wandering, moving from one place to another, looking for better real estate, I guess, which maybe in a sense where Americans are wanderers too. I don't know. But he was a wanderer. Isaac had disputes with the surrounding people as well. Disputes over wells again. And many of them were wells that his father had dug. And Isaac, although it's not advertised as much, Isaac and his wife Rebekah, they battled with infertility as well. In fact, it's 20 years, if you look at the math and you read the story, 20 years between the time that they were married and that they were able to have their first child. And it says that Isaac prayed to God and God answered his prayer. And what else do we know about Isaac? Well, we know that the same promises that God gave to Abraham, he gave to Isaac. In Genesis chapter 26, verse 24, the Lord appeared to Isaac one night and said, I am the God of your father Abraham. This is how God introduces himself. I am the God of your father. Don't be afraid, for I am with you. I will bless you, and I will increase the number of your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham. The same thing I said to Abraham is going to apply to you. The promise applies to you as well. So, Isaac inherited a lot of those things. But here's something you may not know, is that Abraham and Isaac made the same mistakes. You know that? For example, very early after Abraham moved to Canaan, there was a famine in the land. And we're told that Abraham and Sarah, that they moved to Egypt where they could find something to eat. And this is what happened. Traveling was very treacherous in those days. Abraham, a prosperous man, traveling to Egypt. We're told in Genesis chapter 12, verse 11 and 12, it says, they were about to enter Egypt. He said to Sarai, and her name's changed to Sarah later, said, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but will let you live. Like I said, traveling was very treacherous in those days. And so here's what brave Abraham says. This is what we should do, okay? Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. Basically, to save my own neck, I want you to put yourself at risk and to lie. And that is exactly what happens. They see it, Sarah's a beautiful woman. They inquire about her. He says she's my sister, and Pharaoh takes her into his harem. And which means, it doesn't say this explicitly in the Bible, but it doesn't say it didn't happen, which means it's likely that it did. He probably had relations with her. Abraham, the hero, is a coward. He abandons his wife. He exposes her to this kind of vulnerability to save his own neck. Now, there's big arguments made that he was trying to provide for himself, but this is a fact, okay? And this isn't the first time that it happened. In fact, later there's another famine, and at this time, Abraham and Sarah moved down to the Negev, which was the southern part of Israel, which is Philistine country. And this is in chapter 20, verses 1 and 2, and it says, they lived between Kadesh and Shur. For a while he stayed in Gerar. Pay attention to this name of this town. You'll see in a second. And there Abraham said of his wife Sarah, she is my sister. And then Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent for Sarah and took her. Now, in fact, we're actually told this time that Abimelech does not have relations with Sarah. It tells us that specifically. But both times, God intervenes. And if he hadn't have intervened, who knows what would have happened? Abraham got Sarah back. God just basically revealed to Pharaoh and Abimelech that you've got the wife of another man, and I'm going to kill you if you don't send her back. Basically, was what happened. Something to that effect, and he got her back both times. But we see the weaknesses of Abraham. This is what's so cool about the Bible, is that it's not afraid, even of the greatest heroes, to show they were not perfect. But guess what happens? The mistakes that Abraham makes, that Isaac would have seen his father making, are the same mistake. Isaac does the exact same thing. In chapter 26, verse 7, there was a famine, and they moved back. They settled in Gerar for a brief time. And it says that this is Isaac and his wife Rebekah. It says, when the men of that place asked him, that is Isaac, about his wife, he said, she is my sister. Because he was afraid to say, she is my wife. He thought the men of this place might kill me on account of Rebekah, because she is beautiful. And so we see the mistakes of the father are repeated by the son. Can we all say this and agree? I think this is why it's pictured so beautifully in the Bible. This is what's so cool about the Bible. It lends to the authenticity. That it just doesn't present the heroes in only a positive light. It shows their weaknesses too. And it shows us that just as it was for the people of Israel and their backstory, so it's true for our backstory too. That our backstories bear blessings. There's good things that were passed on to us we can be thankful for. And there's baggage. There's things that are passed on to us that we don't want to inherit. What could be that blessing for you? Maybe it was the love of a parent, okay? Maybe it was they brought you to church. Maybe it was they set an example for you in working hard. Maybe it was that they passed on something to you that was a blessing for you. Every one of us can look and we can see blessings from our backstories. But we all know that there's baggage too. And sometimes we focus on the baggage more than we do the blessings. Maybe there's addiction. Maybe there was abuse. Maybe there was a bitterness and unforgiveness that was passed down. Maybe the way that you saw your parents relate to each other, or maybe there was it was this total absence of one parent, but you didn't see a way to resolve conflict that was modeled for you in a healthy way. And where was that learned? Probably from their parents and from their parents and from their parents. There was baggage. And so what do we want to do? What do we want to do for you if you're a parent or if you're a child, if you're a grandparent or whatever? You probably think about this. This is in your mind. This is what we're going to be talking about in this series. What do you want to do? What do you want for that child? What do you want for them? You want them to inherit the blessings and let go of the baggage. You don't want that backstory to be repeated. You don't want that part of the story to be repeated, at least. You want a different course to be charted. But sometimes we wonder, is that even possible? I mean, our baggage is our baggage. We're always going to have it. We can't change our story. We can't change our past. And that's true. But I want to offer a word of hope to you today that this is possible. And it's possible because of the lens through which we perceive reality now. And not just perceive it, but the way it really is what I'm going to make a case for you today. Because if you're a Christian, you become a Christian, your primary identity isn't defined by your blood relation, your kin, your family background. Not anymore. Your identity is defined by one man's life. This is what even breaks us from the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament really is the backstory to the Christian faith. It's God's word, but it's different. We're defined by the life of one man. The life of one man, and through his life, we now perceive our lives and even our backstories differently. And that man was Jesus. And of course, what separates Christianity from Judaism is the Old Testament and the New Testament. The story of Jesus begins with the New Testament. And if you were to open up your New Testament to the book of Matthew, in Matthew chapter 1, the very beginning, what would you find? You find a backstory. You find genealogy. An answer. People look at that and like, what in the world? This is so boring. Why do I have to read Jesus' family tree? But what it shows us is that Jesus had a backstory too. And guess what? Jesus' backstory had blessings and baggage. Who was in Jesus' backstory? Well, they list their names, and I'm not going to list all of them because there's like 40 of them, over 40 of them. I'm going to list some of them. This is who's in Jesus' backstory. These were his ancestors. This is who would have been in Jesus' March Madness ancestry chart. There's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, obviously. But then there's Jacob's son, Judah. What do you know about Judah? Judah didn't get off to such a great start. In fact, the line is traced through Tamar, who wasn't Judah's wife, by the way. In fact, she was his daughter-in-law. Ew. Okay, yeah. And he thought she was a prostitute. Okay, you didn't realize this was a PG sermon. You maybe shouldn't. Okay, this is Rahab. She was a prostitute from Jericho, of all places. That place where the walls came tumbling down. There wasn't anything good in there. Rahab was a great-grandmother of Jesus. A descendant of Rahab was Ruth, who was a Moabite, an immigrant, a foreigner. David, who was about her great-grandson, who we know was good. David had great qualities, a man after God's own heart. We also know that David had a great failure. David committed adultery. David stole the wife of another man. And what was her name? Her name was Bathsheba. But guess what? She turned out to be in the family tree. It was through her that Jesus ultimately came to be. Their son was Solomon. And Solomon had his faults and his failures, successes as well. And his son was Rehoboam. And Rehoboam was such a great king, he split the kingdom in half. There was 10 tribes in the north, so we don't want to have anything to do with you, and left. And then there's this list of kings, and I didn't list all of them, but there's some in here like Hezekiah and Josiah who were good kings. But there was some like Jehoram and Ahaziah who were terrible. And Manasseh was so bad that he brought idols into the Holy of Holies. It's very likely that the Ark of the Covenant was lost in the days of Manasseh, that somebody got it out of there because the wickedness had gotten so bad. And so it had to be buried somewhere until Indiana Jones would find it 2,000 years later. But from these came Joseph, who was the husband of Mary, of who was born Jesus. This is Jesus' backstory. But there was something different about Jesus. We see Jesus has all the baggage, like we do. But there's something different about Jesus. Jesus broke the mold. Every one of us, we're fallen. In some way or another, we can try all we want to not to, but we're going to pass some baggage along. I mean, we can't help it. We are going to do that. But Jesus was different. Jesus dropped the baggage. The baggage stopped with Jesus. He creates a new family destiny, which is ironic, considering that he actually never had any children. What happened? The baggage stopped with Jesus because Jesus took our baggage. He took our baggage. He took our baggage for us. And he did this because in his humanity, he had a human mother. He had he had the baggage that we do. But he was the son of a woman, but he was also the son of God. He brings a new backstory into play, a divine backstory. So that if you're in Jesus, this is what's offered to you. I'm not saying the backstory is taken away, or the baggage is taken away. But now in Jesus, we're defined by the blessing, not by the baggage. The blessing that he passes to us is bigger and better and ultimately overwhelms the baggage. Now, this series is going to be about our family dynamics, our nuclear family, or our biological family, or our adopted family, if that's the case for you. But it's going to be about understanding how we relate together as family members so that we can maybe change some of those dynamics and change that legacy that we're leaving. And so that's what we're going to be talking about. But to begin, we got to begin this series by first being made aware that ultimately, for all of us, as important as our biological families or our adopted families are in defining who we are, there's ultimately an even more important identity. There's a spiritual family. And the reason that you and I, that we can look at this story about Abraham and Isaac, and we're going to look at a lot of other cool Old Testament stories throughout this series, but that we have connection with them is because we have a connection in our spiritual families. It's through the Spirit. And ultimately, what we discover when we're talking about the bonds that last, in terms of lasting for eternity, the greatest bond is not the blood of family relations. As powerful as that is, that's what we're going to be talking about the whole rest of this series. But we got to start off saying this. The greatest bond is not the blood of family relations. And that's hard for us sometimes to accept, and really because we live our whole lives with our families, and that's the way we see ourselves. But if you're a Christian, if you're in Christ, you have a new family. Our greatest bond is not the blood of family relations, it's the blood of Jesus. And it's that blood that represents all the baggage. That blood represents everything that shouldn't have been done. Everything that your daddy shouldn't have done and your mama shouldn't have done and grandparents and great-grandparents and everything that you shouldn't have done. Because sometimes we're so big about blaming the baggage, we don't take responsibility for ourselves. Everything that shouldn't have been done. And you know what else shouldn't have been done? The ultimate wrong was that the innocent Son of God, the purest one, the only one who didn't have any baggage, at least didn't contribute to it, that he would be crucified and killed in the most brutal fashion. That blood represents the baggage, but that blood also represents healing. It's healing. So that when you accept Jesus, here's what happens. You have a new family, you have a new bond, and it's not the blood, not the bond of family relations. Because ultimately, your biological family, that DNA that gets passed down, what's going to wind up? Ultimately, rotting and decaying, death. But this new family, this new identity, this new bond lasts forever because it's given by the Spirit. And that's when we talk about when you become a Christian. You're born one time out of water, Jesus said. When you're born from your mother, you have flesh, that's your natural birth. But for those who accept Christ, there's a spiritual birth. You're born again into a new life, and this one never fades. It never ends. And so this is what happened. This is so cool. So if you're bored, we're almost done. But just reel in for just a second here. This is what happens. This is what's happened in Jesus. Jesus took up our human backstory. He had all the baggage of a backstory that we do. He took up our human backstory. Why? So we could share his heavenly backstory. Another part of Jesus' backstory is that he was in heaven forever with the Father. That he's eternal, divine, holy, lives forever. He became what we were and we are so that we can become what he is. And to have his Father as our Father.